Out a repo yesterday. Hopefully you got a chance to take a look at it. There's basically three different branches. Again, sort of hitting this concept of how can we do the same thing multiple different ways, so that hopefully we can see what things are actually doing. I find, for whatever reason, this fields for thing that we're going to talk about to be the second most confusing thing in Rails. Number one for me is asset pipeline. Number two is fields for. Every time I spend time looking at it, I think I understand it and I'm able to explain it to people. And then every time I go to teach it again, I'm completely mystified by it. So I understand it right now, but if you ask me in 3 days, I may not be able to explain it to you anymore. So pay attention closely, because this will be the only time I'll be able to correctly say this. Yes, I'll just watch myself when I forget. So let's see what we can do with this app. I have another server running. Somehow my computer got the ability to run two servers on the same port now, which is impossible. It may be the past. I don't know. Oh, I found out my roommate also remembers Bear and Seed Bears as spelled with an A. So I figured out that he's from the other universe.
Probably move out.
Which video? I don't think I know what you're talking about. Okay.
I remember the cartoon more than the book.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Cool. All right. So if we look at my routes, we can see what I can do. Right. So these are the endpoints that I can hit. These are the only things I can do in my application. So really, the point of this application, I'm doing an asset form. So where do forms normally get rendered from? Which action?
Were they being rendered in the view?
Which action? It's not the index action. It's not the delete action. It's not the show action. It's the new one, right? We're making a new thing, making a new resource, a new object, right? So anytime we make a new thing, it's a combination of two requests, a get request to the new action, and then a post request submitting that form to the create action, forever and always. No different in Rails than it is in Sinatra. So let's go to people new, and we'll see my form. So this is a super basic form. So the first branch of this is just showing okay, I just want to make a very basic person. All this person has is a name and an attribute of permission. This is not how I'd actually do permissions, but just to keep it super simple. So I can make Lewis, and he's an admin. I can post this form. And when I post this form, I have pry in the create action, and I can call person params, which is this method that gets auto-generated when we make a scaffold. And all person params does is it does this weird little strong params incantation, which just says, I'm requiring that one of the top level keys be person, and then I'm permitting that person to have a name and permission and shirt attributes, which we will get to later. So I should be able to run this line, and this should give me a new person object. Cool, right? And then I can say @person.save. Hopefully at this point, this is breathing for you, right? new form, submit a form, call save on it in the create action. We have a new object in the database. Questions on this? Cool. All right, so I let that through. I should have a new person. That redirects me to the show action, so I just sent a get request to people9. So in the browser, I should be at my show action. I am. Fantastic. All right, let's go to a new branch. So I'll reload. I'll go to new again. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to create two objects at once. I want to be able to create a person, and I want to be able to create shirts for that person. This is the weirdest possible description of an attribute of a shirt. But what happened was I started using type. Type is sort of like a reserved keyword in the database, and so I just added any letter to it. So don't be confused by a type. It's just meant to be like, what type of shirt, right? Like, is it a cloth shirt or is it a linen shirt or whatever? Nothing complicated happening there. So I still have this person, and then I have this type of shirt that I want to create for a person. So every time I make a new person, I want to give this person a wardrobe. I want to give them 3 shirts. And how do I do that all in one form is kind of the question of the day. So we talked about form 4 the other day. So in the first view, I made 2 different forms. In the first view, I was using form 4 and using a very specific form 4. So I'm going to go over form 4 again because I think it's really confusing. And please ask me questions if there's things about form 4 that don't make sense. So in the first example, I rendered this view. Now I'm rendering this view. So I'm going to say form 4. The whole purpose of this is a Ruby method that I'm calling that's given to me by Rails. And its goal is to generate HTML. The HTML that it's supposed to generate for me is a form tag with a whole bunch of inputs in it. The 2 most important things about the form tag are what? The action and the method, right? So we need to know where's the form going to post and what is it going to submit. Is it going to be a get or a post? So by default in Rails, if you use form 4, it's going to give you a post. If you're on the new action, it's going to give you a patch if you are on the edit action. And it is smart enough to figure that out by what object you pass it. So if I'm in the controller and I'm in the new action, I need to set up a person object and pass it to this form. So the person object that I'm going to send the form in the new action is going to be a blank object in memory. Usually when I'm in the edit object, the edit action, I'm going to give it a specific person that I want to edit. Right? So form 4 can be smart. Where do we go? Form 4 can be smart, and it can figure out where and what it needs to do based on the type of object that it gets sent. So depending on what you do in your controller, the form's going to behave differently, which we want, right? And it's going to determine where it's going to post and how and what HTTP verb it's going to use to send the form along. Okay, cool. And then the divs we can ignore, right? We get yielded this form builder object, this F object, and we can call methods on that object. We call methods on that object, and we pass those methods arguments, and that will generate inputs for us. So all of these methods here are method calls on an object called F. We can name that object whatever we want. A lot of times people do this. Nope. They'll do something like person fields and call this object person fields. So it's like a little bit more clear. It's an object that builds person fields because this form is bound to a person. The other convention is just using this F. Call it whatever you want, doesn't change it. So we're going to call methods here. We're going to pass arguments to those methods. And the important thing about those arguments is it's going to determine what is the attribute that's going to get passed along in the parameters, right? So if we look at the HTML of this form, we should see a top-level key of person, and then we should see a nested attribute of name, right? So that is what binding to this person is doing. Everything is going to be nested under person because we're calling this f dot method. And then whatever attribute we give it is going to be the key for the second level hash. So we're basically trying to build a hash that's going to get sent across to the server. Okay, so we have a name and we have permission and then we have a submit button, right? So that was the basic form that we saw before. Now what we want is we want person, and then we also want to send along shirt attributes. So what we can do is we can use this fields for method. So fields for works basically exactly like form for, except form for creates a form tag and fields for does not create a form tag. So the goal still is to generate a bunch of input parameters, but we're not going to create the actual form tag, right? So when I call form for, it actually creates this form tag for me, and then I can call f dot whatever on the internal stuff to make parameters that are going to get passed along the way that I want them. With fields for, what I'm saying is, hey, I need to make a bunch of fields for something related to a person, but I don't need a new form tag. I don't want a form inside of a form, but I need basically everything to work exactly the same. So form for works exactly like fields for, except for form for is going to create a form tag. So the purpose of fields for is usually when you want to create fields that are related in some way to some object. So a person has many shirts, right? Person has many shirts. So what I can do is I can literally iterate over all of the shirts for this person. So I'm calling this method shirts, which is an association that I gave it by saying has many shirts. So when I say have many shirts, I define a method. And that method is going to go into the database and say, what are all the shirts that are associated with this person? And then I'm going to get an array of shirts. I'm going to iterate over those shirts. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this crazy thing here, this fields for shirt. So f is still this form builder object. It's the same object that I call text field on, label on, so on and so forth. And the powerful thing about this object is it's been bound to this person. So what I want is I want to nest everything inside of the person in the same way that I want name nested inside of person. I'm going to want associated shirts nested inside of person, and then again to have their attributes. So if we look at what that looks like in the form, we get this sort of thing. So person still top level key. Then we have shirt as the second level key, and then we have type as the third level key. So what I want is I want an array of shirts to get passed through that are related to some person. So again, what I'm doing is I'm just saying, okay, let me iterate over all of these shirts, and I want to create fields for these shirts. So basically what I do is I call fields for, I give it an object that I want to create fields for that's sort of associated with this person, and then that gives me a new form builder object that has this nesting already built into it. And then I can call the same sort of methods like label and text field on this new form builder that gets created. So we kind of like these nested form builders that we create, and the whole goal is so that when the form builders are generating this stuff, they're nesting it properly in the way that we want, so that when everything gets sent across, we have the hash that's like this perfect hash, so that Active Record can do all of its magic. So the whole goal of this, again, is to generate the right HTML, and basically generate sort of like nested HTML. Okay, so then the obvious question, to me at least, is person.shirts. How does this work? So what is at person right now? It's a new person, right? A totally blank person. That came from the controller, right? We know what person is because we said person.new. It's an empty instance of person. And then what I did in the controller, which you may or may not have seen, was I called 3 times at person.shirts.build. Does anybody know what person.shirts.build does? Yeah, so it builds a shirt that's associated with a person and just keeps that in memory. So remember, like active record is doing stuff in memory, and then when you call save, it's writing all that stuff to the database. So right now we have a blank person that's associated with 3 shirts, but all of that just exists in the memory of the computer. We haven't ever written it to the database.
And there's nothing there.
There's nothing there. So there's both something there and nothing there.
They're empty.
So we have basically like these 2 things that are associated, but they're kind of empty, right? So let's jump in here for a second and just see like what's actually going on there. All right, so in the new action, right, I have @person. @person is just our empty person object, right? And then I call @person.shirts.build. So if I call @person.shirts, I've created this association in memory, in like Active Records memory, and I have 3 blank things that are pointed at another blank thing. So nothing's really happened yet, but this association we've told Active Record about is super important. Why is that important? Because later, in my view, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to iterate over those shirts and create fields for those shirts. So I basically created these placeholders, the person that I bound the form to, and then 3 shirts to that person, and now I'm able to like iterate over those shirts. So there's no real dynamic way without JavaScript to do something like this. So what you might want is you might want in this form to be able to like have a button that says like add a new shirt or something like that, and have a new field magically pop up. Without JavaScript, there's no way to do that. So typically what we do is we say, okay, everybody gets 3 shirts, like before we get to JavaScript, and we just say, okay, there's this fixed number of shirts that when we create a person, everybody gets 3 shirts, or the ability to get 3 shirts, or something to that effect. So if I want to change the number of like preset shirts that somebody can have here, how would I do that? Yeah, so if I just come into the controller and I change how this association gets built, if I call 5 times, now I should get 5 shirts. Right, so now I have 5 shirts. Does that make sense how that happened? This is super important. Okay, so in the controller, right, I create this person object, I create this association, and then I'm able to iterate over these blank objects, pass each blank object to fields for, until it create this nested association. Cool. All right, so that's one way to do this, and then there's like an even more like Railsy, like clever way to do this. This is something that we end up doing all the time. So of course, like Rails tried to build us another abstraction to do this. So this is like me trying to show you like the literal way that this is happening. This is kind of what's happening under the hood. Now we'll switch to like the Railsy sort of more magic way. So hopefully like you don't forget what's actually going on. And we can like visualize when we see the Railsy way what's happening under the hood, so it's not like totally magic to us.
Can we look at it for just one moment?
Absolutely.
Can you repeat what Bill said?
Yes.
He creates a row, and then
So let's just talk through the whole flow again. So the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to hit the controller, right? And we're going to set up all of the objects that are going to be available in the view. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a totally blank person, right? I'm going to put pry back here. So we make a blank person, right? @person is just an empty object, right? And my goal is when I get to the view, I want the view to like have these magical objects that know stuff, right? That know about each other. So right now I have a person. I want to tell the person about the shirts that I'm going to create for him, her, whatever. So what I do is I say 5 times, let me call build. So where does build come from? Build comes from so I look at the Active Record guide. It tells me when I define has many, I get all of these methods for free. Right? So .collection would be, in this case, .shirts. Right? .shirts shovel. .shirts delete. I also get .shirts build. So what .shirts build does?
Do all this create sugar like for the shovel method?
Uh,
Right there, it's done the like
Yeah, so the syntactical sugar is actually not. It's like fake sugar, sort of. Like it's like you can write. Well, I guess no, it is because you can write collection space shovel, and that's actually calling this method.
It does, so it does.
I don't know how that works, to be quite honest with you, because it's not built into Ruby.
Yeah, I know, that's what I was saying.
Yeah, so that's actual magic. um, so what build does is when we create a shirt has these attributes, right? It has an A type, or like its type, and it has a person ID, right? Because a shirt belongs to a person. People have many shirts. So a shirt needs to know, who do I belong to, right? So if I wanted to create a shirt manually, I could say shirt create A type is, can't type, cloth, and then I could say its person ID is 1, right? So I could manually tell this shirt, you belong to the first person. But that's kind of annoying because I have to like remember which person this shirt belongs to. I have a person already that doesn't have an ID because it hasn't been saved to the database yet, and I want to tell these shirts, hey, you belong to this person. When I call save, just magically put the person ID in your row because I already told you about the person that you're associated with. So right now what I want to do is I want to associate a bunch of shirts with this person. And the way I can do that is I can say @person.shirts.build. And what that does is it says add a new blank shirt to this collection of shirts. So now I have 6 blank shirts. If I call it again, I should have 7 blank shirts, and so on and so forth. So I'm creating this association between these two things only in memory, and saying I want to add this thing to this collection, but only do it in memory, and only when I call save later actually like write to this object and say make all of these objects person ID, whatever is the ID of the person you create in the database. So you're like pre-creating association that will just magically happen later, so that you don't have to manually set the ID of the belongs to association.
Wait, so when does the save take place?
When does the save take place?
Yeah.
It will take place when, so I'm like somewhat misrepresenting things, because objects only know about each other for the life cycle of the request. The new request, I'm creating this association so that when I come in here and I iterate over the shirts, I get 5 blank shirts in the view. When I post that form, I'll hit the create action, and I'll have this big hash, and that's when they actually get saved. But it's not really that they get saved. It's that like I created these things in memory, and that allowed me to create a view. Then I submitted the form, and that form had this big nested data structure. And then when I created the person here and I called save, it like magically created those associations. So I never actually call save in anything related to new. Save gets called in create.
So I kind of don't understand how person ID, I think, is populated in the shirts, bro. Like when you create a new shirt.
Yeah, so
How does it know to populate person ID?
so it does it here in this step. So we haven't gotten here yet. So let's talk about that when we get to the form posting. Other questions on this? Do we understand what build is doing?
Yeah, so it creates an object and then associates it with the object we call
Just in memory.
and just in
Cool. All right, so that's what build does, right? So, right, if I change the number of times that I call build, yes.
The difference between like create and build is that it's creating a save user, whereas build uses an object that's not persistent.
That's actually a good question. I don't know what would happen if you called build.create on an unsaved user. I assume it would probably call save on the person as well.
So
But I'm not
you're
100%
only making these people or these shirts just to populate a form.
Yes.
They don't. So yeah, so they don't really exist.
Yes.
Never going to exist.
Yes.
Well, they do exist. They're just in memory.
It depends how you define existing or not existing. I think you're both saying the same thing, but the opposite.
Yeah.
They exist If you think they exist, they don't exist.
Well, they don't exist after you make the format. They only exist until you make someone.
Yeah. All right. So the whole purpose of calling build was to create this purely in-memory association so that when I got to the form, I could iterate and say, how many associated objects do I have? Well, I have like 7 because I manually did that in the console. So once I get to the view, right, the whole purpose was now I can call person.shirts, and it'll give me a whole bunch of blank shirts.
Oh, allow me to edit blank shirts.
Cool? We can do it again if this is still hasn't sunk in. It's a lot.
Let's say you have one of the shirt fields. Okay, let's say type was couldn't be null.
Okay.
Well, since it's not going to database, that was right?
It's going to end up in the database, but it hasn't been submitted yet. So we'd handle that on the create side.
Well, but say we knew the
Doesn't actually add any shirts.
probably create 5 shirts. Like, is that just creating shirts apart from manually doing the console? So like when you save it, is it gonna save 7 shirts that you made, or is it gonna save 5?
So what I did was basically all the building I did was to generate this form.
Right.
If I only submit one type of shirt,
Oh, it's only gonna save.
it's only going to make one.
Can I like change save to build so it'll save this to the database?
Yes.
So if you didn't use build, then you wouldn't see a tag.
Yeah, so if I I'll get rid of build in the controller. So now I'm just going to create a person. If I get no. So now I still have build here. I have 5 empty objects in my view. So now I'll actually submit this. All right, so I have 5 shirts in my form, right? And the whole goal of this is I want like a really nice params hash that comes across. That was the whole point of building this form. So let's see if we can figure out like what's going to come across. So form's going to post to /people. Which action is going to handle that? Which action in the controller handles a post to /people? Create. How do we know? We can go to our routes, right? And our routes say a post to /people goes to people create. So you don't have to memorize this stuff.
It's also in the
It's also in the controller.
Small question.
Yeah.
Why are those commented out? Is that just like so?
They added these as notes
Okay.
to
so,
people.
like,
It's because this is a scaffold. Advanced developers don't really use it, so it's like for beginners, this will show you. Okay, right. So this form is going to post to /people, so it'll be handled by the create action in the people controller. It's going to actually post, right? And we're going to have this person field. So I should have a top level key of person. Inside that, I should have a name attribute. I should have what else? A permission attribute, and I should have a shirt attribute. And inside the shirt attribute, I should hopefully have an array of these types of shirts. So let's see what comes across. So I want to put, okay, so I have pry and create. Let's post this, and all we really care about is what comes across in the parameters. So I get top level key of person, right, which makes sense because of our attributes, our name attribute. I get the name key, right, and I put in Blake as the value. I get the permission key, I put in admin, and then I get a shirt where the result is a hash. So this is not what I wanted. What I was hoping for is that a shirt would come through with an array of hashes where a type pointed to that type. What ended up happening was all of my shirts like merged, right? All of them had the same key, and I ended up just getting the last value, right? So I submitted all of these shirts, and all I got was the last value. So I think what I need is the params here, if I'm remembering correctly, need that there or here. I always forget. So let's look back at my. So I'm doing fields for each individual shirt. Interesting. So maybe this is not a valid way to do this. All right, I want to come back to this and play with this in a minute. So right now, what we can take from this is this did not work, right? The whole point of this was to set up our hash so that I could perfectly create a new person and that I would have shirts attributes as the key, because that's what I have in my required and permitted parameters. And I was hoping that I would get an array of all my shirts. So right now, only one shirt is sort of like coming through in the parameters. So I sort of like lost 4 of my shirts. Does that make sense? Like why this is wrong? It's no good? Okay. All right, so let's go to the next branch. So the difference here is I'm going to use fields for, but I'm going to use it slightly differently. So before, what I did was I said I have this person, right, and I'm going to iterate through all of the shirts for that person, and I'm going to call this fields for each individual shirt object that I'm iterating over. And then I'm going to create fields for that individual shirt. What I'm doing here is I'm saying, let me be a little bit smarter. Let me use this nice Railsy thing, fields for, and I can tell it I want fields for like shirts or this collection name. So I've defined this association called shirts, and I'm telling it, hey, F object. The F object was bound to the person up here. So F knows that like it is worried about people, right? And anything that we call on it should be nested inside that, right? Like f.text field is going to be person, permission. Here I'm saying, hey, I need to generate fields for an entirely different collection, and that collection is called shirts. So then inside here I'm doing the same thing where I just say, okay, and the attribute that I care about is a type. And then hopefully when I come into my, my new form, we should get a different type of nesting. So what I get here is Rails auto-generated person, and then this shirts attributes key. And then what Rails always does, you don't necessarily need this 1, 2, and 3. Even an empty array would work. But what it does is it basically says, okay, I want to nest inside this shirts attribute an array. It's either an array or a hash. And the keys will be 1, 2, and 3. So I have 3 different elements. And those elements are all going to be individual hashes that hold an individual shirt. So this is like the Railsy way to do this. Rails auto-generates all of this stuff so that when we send it through on the parameters side, we should magically get like the exact right nested data structure that we need. So the question is like, what is this going to look like on the server side, right? So we looked at the HTML we generated using this fields for, right? Let's see what this looks like. So I'm going to send this across. I'm going to look at my parameters. And now what I have is I have same thing, name, top level key, right? Permission, top level key. But now I have a shirts attributes key, which points to a hash. And that hash has keys of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I've separated the different shirts into different keys. So they didn't override each other because in the HTML, they each had this key here, whereas before this key was missing and I just had shirt A type. So before it overrode it, right? Because of how this parameter is structured in this name attribute. And now it's coming through, and on the server side, it's separated them into individual shirts. And the reason this is great is because what I would really like is I'd really like to be able to call person.create and just pass in person params. So this is like a really nice Railsy way of creating a person and all of that person's associated shirts, rather than saying like, let me create the person and then let me individually create these shirt objects and then let me associate those shirt objects with the person. All of that is happening in one command right here, just by saying create this person and passing along these associated shirt attributes. It knows to create all of the shirts in the database and associate them at the same time. So let me hit exit and let this run. And we can see what ran in the database, right? We inserted into people, we created this person, and then we did 5 inserts into the shirts table, created those people, and the associated, it created that person ID number 11. So that was your question, Gil, right? Was like, when we create the shirts, how does the person ID get filled out on the shirts? It gets filled out when we have the right structure, and we call create. Active Record will just magically do all of that for us. So it's like, again, if we follow like some convention and we have the parameters in the right structure, Active Record will just do it for us. So one last thing about how this is all working. All of this magic where I can call, where am I? So I called person.create or person.new and then save, and I just pass in these person parameters. All of that is available because of something that I did in the model. So I don't know if you caught this before. I have this thing accepts nested attributes for. So what I'm saying to the person model is, hey, when I create you, I might want to create you with your associated objects. So rather than doing it all individually and manually, I'm telling it, hey, I'm probably going to pass you shirts in the same call where I create you. And where I do that is in this controller right here. So I pass it at that whole big nested hash, and it will accept that hash because in the model I told it, hey, you should be ready to accept attributes for a totally different model. Because this is such a common thing. Gian and then Carson.
I'm just trying to catch what I missed, because like if I go into my inspector, I still have it where it shows just shirts and then the A type, but not as part of person. It's not like it's listed as person.
Are you on the last branch, the third branch?
There are different branches.
There's 3 branches?
So it shows a progression of like.
Are you looking at my code on your own computer, or are you on Join Me, or what's going on?
No, I have Git that you submitted.
Okay, so which branch are you on?
It just says there's just master.
Okay, so there's more than one branch. I'm on branch number 3. So, again, this is like one of the most magical incantations I think there is in all of Rails. It's super common, but let's just like walk through all of the things that need to be true to make this work. So let me get rid of this. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Can you go deeper? Like, can you say like a shirt has buttons? Like has an order? Like whenever you make a shirt, you need to create an order for buttons, and then say like when you submit a person, it submits their shirts, and then it also makes like 50 orders for buttons based on what kind of shirt they ordered or whatever.
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. Probably. If you can't do it using like anything out of the box in Active Record, I can show you how accepts nested attributes for works. I mean, you can imagine this is just like doing some metaprogramming and defining a method. I think it makes a method called shirts attributes equals. So you could write that method probably on the shirt model and have it do like the association yourself if it doesn't automatically do it.
Can you show me the file where you make the shirt attributes, or like how you get them to save?
How you get them to save? Yeah, so right here, we just do person.new, and then you pass it the person parameters. Person parameters is that method that we have to make because of strong parameters, and I just tell it you're required to have a person, and you have name, permission, and shirts attributes, which is an
Little bracket, like 0, or an empty bracket to make the number of shirts.
Say that again?
It's like, you put an empty bracket between like
Oh, in the
person
HTML?
shirt.
Yeah. How did that happen?
I just want to see it.
Oh, yeah.
That happens because you pass in person params and create it.
I'm not sure if you guys are saying the same thing. Say what you said again.
I wanted to know like
I just
why.
wanted to look at where it was.
Okay, well why did that?
All right, let me do him first, and then come back to you. So here's our form, right? So this is what that looks like.
Alright, and then you left it empty. And just
So the first time I had just person, shirt, A type. And really the big difference was adding this array thing in the middle. And if you don't have the numbers in there, it'll make it an array. If you have the numbers in here, it will make it a hash with the keys as these things.
that's what you saved it. Okay.
And that was all generated. What was your question? How did it generate this? Okay. So it's a combination of things. First thing you need is accepts nested attributes for. So you need to tell the model you can accept nested attributes for shirts. Then on the controller, in the new action, we have to build associated shirts. Then in our form, we do fields for off of the form builder. We give it the name of the collection that it accepts nested attributes for. Has many shirts, accepts nested attributes for shirts. And we tell it, hey, like we're building shirts for this like associated record. And so then when it runs this code, it will figure out when it creates this text field, it's a text field that its top level key is person. It knows that because of it's bound to the F, which is bound to person. We're calling fields for shirts, so it figures out, oh, okay, this has got to be in the format that Active Record wants, shirts attributes, next key. And then this is going to be multiple of them because this is the collection, and each one of those is going to have one of these individual attributes. So again, the way that all of this works together, the first thing you need is accepts nested attributes for. If I take this away and I re-render this form, it no longer shows me all of the associated shirts, it just shows me one. If I put accepts nested attributes for back and I re-render this form, I get all of the ones that I built in the controller. So the first thing you need is at the model layer, you need to tell the model, hey, like we're wiring all this stuff together. Person and shirts are related and I want them to work together in this whole cycle. Once I have that, I have to come to the controller and I have to actually create associated shirts in memory. Then I have to come to the form and say, hey, build me some fields for these shirts. Right? So F is bound to the person, and then I'm telling it, hey, there's a related association called shirts, and I've already created some objects in memory called shirts. So build me this magical nested hash in my HTML so that when it gets submitted, it will just magically work.
2 questions.
Yes.
One question, it showed one shirt. I would think that it would show the count shirt level. Why did it show?
I agree with you. Like if I had written it, that's how I would make it. I would have it call the shirts method, and if it returned an empty array, I would do nothing here. I assume what they're saying is if you're calling fields for shirts, at the very least you want to create one shirt. But again, this is one of those things where like somebody made this method and they just decided how it was going to work, and they said at the very least we'll always do one, even if you have none in that like in-memory array. But if you have more than one, we're just going to iterate over that array the however many times you have objects in the array.
The second thing, if you can go back to the controllers.
Yeah.
Back to permit as well. What's the shirts attributes?
Mm-hmm.
Set to the array.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to designate the attribute, or can you just set it to an empty array and it will get all the attributes?
You have to designate the attribute, otherwise it will say unpermitted attribute.
So that every attribute you have to
That's the whole idea behind strong parameters, is every single thing that you're going to save into mass assignment, you have to whitelist.
So there's no way to like, there's no shorthand to like just get all the attributes.
By design, this is the only thing in the whole Rails ecosystem that they want to make as difficult as possible. Because they don't want people to screw up security. Security is something that they're like, we don't want to make this easier. We want you to be really thinking about anything you write here. We want you to be whitelisting it. We want you to be very specific and say, each individual thing that can be mass assigned, I am listing right here. If it is not here, there's no way it can possibly work. We don't want any magic happening, because if you add magic into security, then hackers are like, oh, if I figure out your magic, right, like, I can magically take over your system. Yes. In memory means like only the computer knows, and the minute I exit the program, the computer forgets. So if I say x equals 7, and then I ask the computer what x is, computer knows it's 7. If I exit this program, and I come back in IRB and I ask it what x is, what's it going to tell me? I don't know what x is, right? Or it's going to crash. So that means it's just in memory, right? The computer is just keeping it in its memory until we free that memory. So memory versus persistence. So if I said x equals 7, and then I wrote a record to the database where I said the first row in the x table is 7, then I could come back in and say, what's the first row in the x table? And it would tell me it's 7. That would be a persistent way of keeping track of that. So I keep saying in memory because in here, in my controller, I'm creating this association, but it's just in memory. If I don't ever submit it via form and save it to the database, nothing will ever happen. So it's just like temporarily this exists, and it's totally possible that it could disappear or somebody could never call save on it. The minute I call save on it, it's persistent.
And the reason you don't just call save in you is because you want to call it in the post, right? Or else it'll just save a bunch of nil rows.
Yeah, so that's exactly it, right? So if I knew in advance all the things my users were going to do, then I wouldn't need to build a web app, right? I would just like write a script that wrote records to the database. But the whole point is I want to ask you, what person do you want? What shirts do you want? And I can't know. So I'm giving you empty objects and saying, hey, I know you're going to need something. I don't know what it is. I'll give you these objects. You fill them out. You send them back to me via this form. And then I'll recreate new objects and save them to the database.
If your person had like 10 shirts before they went to this like link, would it list all the shirts they already have?
Yeah, so this is the cool thing about using all of these conventions. If you follow these conventions, it will make your life great. So now I can go to people and I can show, well, I didn't think I did on the show view, but on the edit view now, right, I'm going to render the exact same form. So I didn't have to make two different forms. The form 4 figured out that now when it submits, it should submit to people11 rather than just /people. And it should somewhere in here have added that like that method thing to make it a, yeah, Pash. So it knows enough to make it a patch, right, rather than just a post, because we're editing now. And additionally, like, it has already filled out all of this information for me, because it knows I'm editing this specific person and this specific person's associated shirts. So when somebody wants to edit, what we want is not for this stuff to all be blank, right? We don't want this person fields to be blank. This @person object now is a real person that we got out of the database, not one that we made in memory. And then when we iterated over their shirts were real shirts that were in the database. So if we kept adding more shirts to this person, every time we looked at this form, there would magically be a dynamic number of shirts. You know, if we made shirt number 8, if we came back to this form, you'd see 8 shirts. Because we're iterating over the collection of associated shirts for this specific person. And then as we fill out the form, we're saying, okay, this person has filled out values for these shirts. We can see those values. What's that? Where I saved the person? Yeah. So this form, the new form is going to submit to the create action. I call person.new, and then person params, and then I call save right here. And this all works because the hash that gets passed by person params, we have carefully structured by creating the form in that exact format. Does anybody want me to talk through this again?
Just quickly, so new doesn't say that the respond to is explicitly called. Like what is?
Yeah. So new doesn't save. So new's job is to generate the form. So new is going to render by default the new.html.erb, which is here. In here we render a partial, the fields form, which is this guy that we've been looking at. So its job is just to build a form. Then once we submit the form, we're basically recreating objects that somebody on the client side, made in a form, and we're creating that object and then saving it to the database.
So I'm saying, when does it get saved? Like the respond to form.
Oh yeah, sorry, right here.
Oh, so the if actually saves.
Yeah, so we say if, this is kind of a confusing thing. So save returns a Boolean, either true or false.
But it actually saves it also, right?
Yeah, so we run this line of code, it either returns true or false. If it returns true, it has actually saved to the database. And that is what we use as our determination of whether we should redirect you to show or whether we should re-render this new page with your errors on it. Other questions? This is incredibly complicated. Okay. We'll have to end there then.